Hi everyone, so welcome to day 2 of YA Thrillercon. We're kicking off today's events with a Q&A session with Stuart Gibbon, who is a former police detective and he also runs a consultancy business helping thriller and crime writers with police procedure. So this is a live broadcast, and if you're watching live and you want to ask a question at any point, you can just pop it in the Q&A chat facility, which will be right next to the stream on YouTube. So right next to the video, you can just pop it in there, and then we should see it live as we're talking, and we'll be able to answer your questions. So it's a great way to get a bit of an interactive conversation going as well, if there's something you particularly want to know. And it's a good way to get any questions answered. If you want to see the schedule for YA Thrillercon, because this is day 2, we've got all the panels and interviews from yesterday and readings, and then we've got others coming up today. You can visit www.yathrillercon.co.uk, and you can find links for all of those on the website. All the videos will stay up on YouTube, so if you miss one live, you can catch up at any point. So, Stuart, would you like to start off by giving a bit of an introduction about yourself and your background?
Yeah, hi Madeline, hi everyone. Thanks very much for inviting me to YA Thrillercon. It's great to get the opportunity to have a chat on this lovely morning with the sun shining in the UK. Mine, as you said, is Stuart Gibbon. My background really is in policing. I joined the police actually as a teenager. I was 16 when I joined the police. I was born in the north of the UK and I moved down to London to be a police officer. I spent around about 20 years or so working in London, first of all as a uniformed officer patrolling the streets, and then afterwards as a detective. I relocated to the middle of the UK, the East Midlands area, and I spent a few more years there working again mainly as a detective. My background is really crime investigation, particularly murder and serious crime. I left the police force a few years ago and had a bit of a break, but then decided I wanted to carry on doing something to help people, which is what I'd always tried to do before. And I decided to set up my own business, and part of that business is now as a writing consultant. So I work with authors, mainly crime authors because of my background, but sometimes I also do help authors from other genres who just might need the odd question answering about how the police do something, maybe procedure-wise, or an investigation or something like that. So I've been doing that now for a few years, been lucky enough to work with many different talented authors, and it's something that I really enjoy, which gives me a great deal of pleasure. Although I haven't got a massive experience in working with YA writers, I'm hopefully going to build that up over the course of the next few months, and this is a great opportunity to tell people what I do, and if there are any questions out there about the writing that I do, or maybe about my police career, I'd be happy to answer them.
Wonderful. So to start with, how important would you say accurate police procedure in fiction is, whether we're talking about YA or adult books?
That's a good question to start with. I would say it is important, but what I always say to people when they ask me about police procedure is that it's something that you don't have to put in the book. You don't need to have a lot of police procedure, certainly. If you've got a book that you're writing and it's kind of full of procedure, it almost becomes like a reference book. So if it's a fiction book, you can put procedure in by all means, but I think if you have too much in, the book becomes quite a dull read. So, but what I do also say to people is if you're going to put something in procedural and it's specific, so maybe something like when the police arrest somebody, they have to give them a caution afterwards, and the caution's quite a mouthful, and it's something that you learn as a police officer, and you don't forget the wording of it. So if you are going to write, in your book that somebody's been arrested and they've been cautioned, and if you are going to actually write that caution, you need to get that caution right, because you can guarantee that either people who were police officers or just that got a bit of a general knowledge of how the police work will pick up on something like that and probably comment on it, and it might put certain readers off from actually reading more of that book or reading further books by the same author. So my advice is, if you're going to put it in, make sure it's right, particularly the specific details. Having said that, if you're just going to deal with somebody that's been arrested, then you can write that they've simply been arrested by the police and taken to the police station. That's still kind of a procedural issue, but it doesn't go into the detail. So I guess an answer to your question would be, I think it is important, but actually you don't need to put lots in, but whatever you do put in needs to be accurate, in my opinion, because it helps to make the book more authentic.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So what is the most common mistake that you see relating to police work in the representation of it in books?
I think really it comes down to the finer detail, because obviously if people haven't been a police officer, they don't know somebody, or they don't know how the system works, they might not know the specifics. So I guess really one of the common things that I see in writing books, when authors ask me questions, is about the role of individuals within the police system itself. Okay. So I'd probably split that in two areas. I'd say people who work with the police. So a prime example of that is something that we've discussed previously, is the role of the pathologist.
Yeah.
Obviously, it differs from different countries, but in the UK, the pathologist isn't a police officer, but they work very closely with the police. But what they don't do is they don't kind of investigate the crime. So the pathologist won't go out taking witness statements from people. They won't interview people and things like that. Now, in the UK, we have a program called Silent Witness, which does deal with pathology, and obviously it's written in a certain way where it portrays a slightly different approach from the pathologist. So I think based on what people's perceptions of watching TV and maybe reading the odd book about these sort of things, people think that roles like the pathologist are more proactive in terms of the investigation, when actually they're not. They're very important. Another one I would say is the coroner. People refer to the coroner quite a lot, talking about the coroner is a very important person and has overall responsibility in the UK, certainly, for every death that occurs, whether it be natural or unnatural or unexpected. But what they don't do, similar to the pathologist, is they don't go out and interview people. They're actually kind of a little bit removed from that system, and they make the key decisions around an inquest and death and that sort of thing. So I'd say really some of those roles people don't, understandably, because they've had no experience often, don't understand where they fit into the criminal justice system. And also, I guess TV sometimes shows the senior officers as conducting a much more proactive role than in reality they do. So again, I talk UK because I have got a little bit of experience about watching American dramas and that sort of thing. But with UK in particular, you'll find that some of the true crime, the police dramas portray the senior officer in charge of the case as doing virtually everything in the case, which of course is really quite difficult to manage. So it's a far more, in reality, it's a far more removed role. They don't interview people. Your senior lead detective will not be sitting in a police station opposite a suspect interviewing them, because that doesn't happen. It's the detective constables and the ones who are doing all the real kind of hands-on work who will be doing those sort of interviews. So I guess it's just some of those sort of kind of little issues about the roles that people play in the system, whether they be people that work with the police or police officers themselves, and also the way that those officers engage with each other, the terms that they use to call each other. It's a little bit more informal than it's often portrayed. So, for example, in the UK, the rank of sergeant exists, which is you have the rank of constable, and the next rank in seniority to that is sergeant. But sergeants aren't called sergeant, if that makes sense. So, for example, my name is Gibbon. I used to be Sergeant Gibbon, but nobody ever called me Sergeant Gibbon when I was having a conversation with them, because it's not the way that police officers engage with each other. They use a shortened term, which is Sarge. It's short sergeant. And obviously people of the same rank or higher rank would just use your first name. So it's a lot more informal than sometimes people write it. But again, their perception of how that goes is often guided by books and mainly television and films and social media. So it's just the kind of finer things that someone that's been in the police or has a knowledge of the police can provide, that just again helps to just make it a little bit more realistic, because there are a lot of police officers out there who read these sort of books. Some of them now write them, and there are serving police officers that write crime fiction as well as doing the job of a police officer. So they're the sort of people that will read these books. It's not often a huge issue. It's just one of people actually not knowing how it works because they've never experienced it, which I fully understand.
Yeah. So yeah, I know that YA thrillers aren't your usual genre for reading, and ahead of this con, I sent you a list of recommendations for my favorite YA thrillers. I think it was The Darkest Corner by Clara Thomas that you started with reading. So what did you think of it?
I've recently just finished it actually, and I really enjoyed it. It's the first kind of experience I've had of reading a YA book of that nature. In fact, I've not read many YA books, but you've kind of given me some recommendations that I'm going to chase up, and that certainly whetted my appetite. I thought it was a beautifully written book, which dealt with some real issues around families, and obviously I won't give any spoilers out for those who might not have read the book, but what I would do is I would recommend it for anybody who's interested in reading YA, because it's a fabulous book. Interestingly, it is also based on a real case, which I understand is a lot of these sort of YA books that deal with injustice and these sort of societal issues are based on reality, which is important. And I just liked the way it was written, and the point of view that was put forward. I was also quite interested in the police involvement, and again, without giving too much away, the police were involved in the book, certainly not as a main protagonist or anything like that, or lead character, but there was some link with the police and a personal link with a member of the family of a police officer. And I thought that the way that was written was also quite interesting in the way that the lead character, if you like, was trying to get to the bottom and find justice for something that had happened a few years ago, and their relationship or otherwise with the police in the case, where, you know, how easy or otherwise it was to try and get information taken on board by the police and for them to do something about it. I thought that was quite interesting, the way that was written, but certainly from a point of view of being in a book that's really enjoyable and that stays with you after you've read it. And actually, when you finish reading it, you want to kind of, you're a bit sad that it's actually finished because you wanted to carry on finding out what happened. Really, really interesting book. And thanks for the recommendation. As I say, I'm building up a bit of a list now. So if people don't see me for a while, I'll be sort of hidden away somewhere, catching up on the YA genre. No doubt about that.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned that The Darkest Corners does cover some like quite serious topics. So I'm intrigued to know if anything has surprised you in your reading of like this YA thriller, because I know some people, when I've encouraged them to read this genre, they've been really surprised by the darkness in some of these books. Like they had the misconception that dark issues aren't really covered in YA, which is obviously incorrect, because there isn't really sort of any issue that is off bounds in YA, because we're writing about the issues that teenagers are going to be exposed to and issues that they will be facing. So was that something that surprised you?
I think a little bit, not too much. I didn't really. It was great because I didn't really know what to expect when I started to read it. I'm not, as I say, I've not had much, if any, experience of reading YA, and I was a bit kind of. What I did notice was it was a word I would use to describe the book is powerful. It's a really powerful book because it just kind of reaches out to you and gives these really powerful messages. I like the way it was written in terms of. Sometimes with adult fiction, of course not always, but sometimes you do get a lot of violence and kind of stuff that's almost unnecessary to the point that it's so graphic, if that makes sense. But actually this sort of book is getting across really powerful messages without having to go down that route. Now, whether that's because the author's chosen to go down that route or whether that's the way YA books of that type are written, I don't know, and I'll know when I've read more of that sort of genre. But I was just really impressed. I wasn't surprised at all with the way it was written, but I was impressed by the way it was written in terms of how the issues were dealt with, without the need to go into a great deal of particular graphic detail, because sometimes I think it's just a little bit unnecessary. and you can still get the message across by writing it in a kind of slightly different way. So I'd say I wasn't shocked or surprised, and darkness, yeah, possibly, but some real life issues that, as I say, might help other people to come to terms with some of the issues that they may have as a young person and a teenager. Very, very impressive book. So as I say, looking forward to reading more similar kind of books.
Yeah, definitely. And with what you were saying about, well, YA thrillers do tend to be very character driven and focused on the characterization of the narrator. And you've often got like an internal struggle or internal conflict, which is one of the big focuses of a YA thriller. Because like adult thrillers do tend to get more violent in some cases. So there is definitely sort of that distinction in that respect. Yeah, so I know before when we've chatted, we've discussed how YA fiction often has less of a police presence than in adult fiction. I mean, often this is because adult fiction allows for a protagonist to be a police detective, but in YA, the protagonists are teenagers, so they're obviously not going to be full-on police detectives at that age. So often in YA thrillers, you've got the teenagers doing the police detective work themselves, and often the police characters are more sort of like bumbling figures, or they're people who are trying to stop the teenagers from solving the mysteries, or they just don't think that there's anything to investigate. And of course, it's usually the teens who work out who the killers are before the actual police do in these books. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, it's well, coming from my sort of background, I'd like to see the police solving everything. It doesn't happen. It isn't reality. There are cases for whatever reason in many different parts of the world where there's injustice, where the police don't do the job properly, and I'm realistic enough to know that that's the case in a lot of places. So I think it makes sense. I guess there's two ways of looking at it. One is you can write it how you feel you want to write it, and is it that important that it's not overly realistic in terms of the main thing is getting the issues across. And as I mentioned earlier on, it's the procedural side of things and how the police approach the case can be written how the writer wants to write that. But actually thinking about it, there are, I would say, youngsters, young people, teenagers, and when it comes to social media and use of technology, mobile phones, the way the world is moving in terms of technology, they're far more switched on a lot of the time than adults are. So for an example, I get a new phone and I'm not entirely sure how to work this new phone, and I go to a young person, which I did, to get them to show me how to use it properly, because they're brilliant at it a lot of the time. I know that's a bit of a stereotype, but it's actually true a lot of the time, because they're using them all the time, whereas when I grew up, you know, we had a calculator and that was kind of about it, really. So mobile phones, the internet and all those social media, sometimes they're a little bit new. And I have to say, I'm one of the first to put my hands up and say I'm a bit of a dinosaur when it comes to things like Facebook and Twitter. And I do use them now, but I've had to drag myself into that part of reality because actually I've never been used to doing it before. But young people are. So when it comes to solving crimes and tracking people down, it's not really that unrealistic for younger people to be able to use social media. There's an instance in the book that I've just read with Clara Thomas where the lead character does a lot of work in the local library, goes to the local library, logs on the internet, starts looking for names and addresses. It's very doable. There's information available in the public domain, quite a lot of it. And so tracking people down, going out and doing things, if you can travel as a young person, can be easier than if you're relying on someone in the police service to do it, for many different reasons. As you say, one of them might be for whatever reason. They might just be not interested. They might not take it seriously for some reason. Or often it's just because they're that busy. You know, they've got limited resources. I speak really more of the UK and where I've worked before and how it is at the moment. They maybe have limited resources, and they've got such a high workload that they have to prioritize what they're doing. And sometimes if somebody goes to them with something and it doesn't, you know, fit in with their criteria, they might be limited as to what they can actually do. So absolutely realistic that younger people can do a lot of the research and a lot of the chasing round. I guess the challenge comes where it goes from there. You know, do they then pass that information to the police? Hopefully they do. Or do they do it in some other way whereby the criminal and the suspect does get captured, because that's the end game. That's what everybody wants. It's the justice that they're looking for, and hopefully they find that. But I think really it's realistic up to a point to have them doing certain things, as long as you don't start going down the road of, you know, them starting to do their own forensic analysis and things like DNA, which I'm, you know, if people write it as a fantasy or whatever, they can write it however they like. It's just finding that balance between this is something they could do and probably would do, and this is something that actually only the police would probably do, because they've got the ability and the skills and the contacts to be able to do it. And of course it differs between the UK and the US, for example, the way that the police handle things and deal with things. But I think it's quite refreshing to read in some books that teenagers and young adults are actually, you know, doing their own inquiries, as long as they don't put themselves in danger or put themselves at risk, because that's another message that in reality you'd need to send out to people. You know, keep yourself safe. By all means, try and get to the bottom of what's happened, but please be careful when you do it.
Yeah, that is actually really interesting, because one of the sort of ways that YA writers often build up tension in their thrillers is through the main character investigating the crime and then putting themselves in danger as a consequence of that. Because usually every YA thriller will have that element in the ending somewhere, around sort of from the 60% mark onwards, like structurally. Like, it is one of the ways that we can build up tension. So obviously, yeah, that isn't giving out the best of like examples for what real life teenagers should be doing, because obviously we don't want people putting themselves in danger. But I am aware that that is one of the ways that we do use that to build up tension, and particularly to increase the pace as well, because pacing and tension are both really important in YA thrillers.
Yeah, I think you can still write it, Madeline. There's no doubt you can do it. That, and I understand it. The tension is important for the reader, particularly when you get into those vital points where, you know, something really big's going to happen. And I guess you could, whoever's writing the books could put something in there that, you know, that conveys that the character knows that they're putting themselves at risk, and kind of wouldn't normally do this sort of thing, but actually because of what's happening, this is what they've done, or the safeguards that they've put in place in case it doesn't end the way they want it to end. You know, so in other words, they've told somebody else, maybe a parent, guardian, or another young person, you know. So for example, if they're going off to do something, you can always have that message within the story that says, you know, they haven't just gone to do it. They've gone to do it because it's important. They've told somebody that they're doing it. They maybe not told them everything, but they've told them where to go, and they've told them what to do if they don't hear back. So little messages like that we would give out to the public anyway, to keep yourself safe. You know, if you're going on your own to meet somebody for the first time, it's a good idea to tell somebody else. You don't have to tell them the full details, but just tell them that you're going, and if you don't ring them back or text them or get hold of them on social media at a certain time, this is what this is what you should do, kind of thing. So just those little messages that could be included in the text of the books as well, just to make it, you know, to say, yeah, this is a risk, but actually I'm looking to mitigate any risk by just putting these little safety measures in place, just in case it doesn't end the way we hope it will end.
Yeah, I can actually see, I can think of several examples of YA books where that is included as part of like the final sort of exploration and the investigation that the teenagers are doing. They do usually tell someone else, and usually it is another sort of like young character, because like parents don't typically get involved in the YA thrillers to that extent. But yeah, you're definitely right about that. So yeah, I was just thinking about one of my favorite YA thrillers. It's called Monday's Not Coming, and it's by Tiffany D. Jackson. It's about systemic racism and injustice, and it is so powerful. So the book is set in the US. The protagonist is called Claudia, and her best friend called Monday. She's been missing for a while, and Claudia can't get the police to take her friend's disappearance seriously. And this is a real life thing, because quite often, as we were saying earlier, YA thrillers do examine current issues that need addressing in society. So in 2017, there was the Missing DC Girls hashtag, which was on social media, and it was shining a light on the disappearance of many young Black girls and how the police weren't investigating their disappearances. and how often people didn't actually know that these girls were missing until their bodies were found. And this is very much the kind of thing that is the sort of setup for the whole premise of Monday's Not Coming. Like, Claudia is the only one who's concerned about Monday. Everyone else is telling her to mind her own business and not to look for her. So, yeah, obviously the police characters in this book are very dismissive of Claudia's concerns about her friend's disappearance. And it is really left to Claudia to find out what happened to her friend. But as we can see, the YA thriller genre is a place where hugely important issues like this can be exposed, particularly when you're looking at injustice and racism. Is this something that you've noticed so far, like reading YA thrillers? Like, I know you've only sort of like read The Darkest Corners, but you did already say that you can see how sort of like real life issues and are being explored in these books, and they're sort of being based on actual like true life events.
Yeah, first of all, I've not read that book, but it's gone straight on my list of recommended reads, so that will be getting read as soon as I can get around to it. Yeah, it is. It's massively important because these are all big issues, and people don't obviously they want to get resolutions for these, and they're quite entitled to expect that to happen in some way, shape, or form. Darkest Corners, again, touches on issues, as I mentioned earlier. It looks like it's based on a real case, a true case. And the book you've mentioned as well, very much so. And I think if these sort of books and the writers who write them can highlight these sort of issues, it can do no harm and hopefully raise people's awareness, because people will be reading these books that don't really know too much about these issues. So it will help to support the cause as well. And again, with the police, as I mentioned earlier, on The Darkest Corners, they obviously had some sort of involvement. Without giving too much away in it, it's clear that some of the characters, and particularly the lead character, felt that they probably hadn't done their job particularly brilliantly, and there was more that they could do to try and track down the person or persons who were responsible for the murders in that particular book. So I think it's really important that these issues are highlighted, and what better way than writing in a YA book targeting young people and teenagers who have got obviously their own views, but they're also growing up and becoming aware of these issues, and they're our future. So they are the sort of people that, you know, that want to make sure that justice is served and that wrongs are righted. So I think I'm all for including them in a way. As for how the police are portrayed, I don't have a particular issue with it because of the way the books are written, because you will get police forces and officers for one reason or another who are better than other officers and who will do a better job, because everybody's different. Every individual has different skills, abilities, and the way they approach life. And although police officers are trained to a certain level, you will still get certain officers who actually do more work than other officers. And it's a very, as being someone that used to be kind of supervising lots of different officers, you do get different skill sets and different kind of personalities and that sort of thing. But I think it's just really important that these issues are raised, and if they can be raised in books like YA books, then all the better. The most important thing is that the awareness is raised, that people are supported to be able to give their viewpoint, and that people read the books, and then no doubt, hopefully, will either go away and kind of research the actual case itself, learn a bit more about it, and might be able to support the cause, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like YA thrillers do often examine the shortfallings of the police and injustices in the system. Now I'm curious, in your work as a consultant helping writers with their depictions of the police, is there something that you've encountered directly in authors' police depictions when it's an adult book? Or are you sort of seeing this more as like a thing that is more specific to the YA readership of thrillers?
No, I have seen it before occasionally. I must admit, not very often, but occasionally I have seen it in the work that I do with writers writing about adult crime fiction. It may be something slightly different. I mean, or it may be. I've had one or two where the authors have written books about a corrupt police officer who is not necessarily a lead character, but plays a big part in the role, because whenever the victim and the witnesses are trying to get the case investigated further, this police officer is kind of getting involved and making sure that nothing else happens. So they're interfering with it, and they're putting themselves in a position where they're frustrating the genuine police investigation. So I've had that once or twice, and I've also had occasionally cases where the police officer is actually committing crime themselves, using their position as a police officer as a kind of safeguard, if you like, so that no one will suspect me because I'm in such a responsible position that I can maybe get away with certain things. It's rare, I must admit, but I have seen it from time to time in the period that I've been advising authors, where they do decide to use a police officer, often not a lead character. Often it's a kind of subplot to what's going on in the actual story, but certainly where things haven't gone the way they should go, and they've actually used that and written it in such a way. In terms of lead characters and police officers, very few. I do read occasionally one or two where their lead officer and the lead character protagonist is a police officer, sometimes a detective, and sometimes a uniformed officer. But yeah, from time to time, you do see issues in relation to the police as an organisation portrayed in adult fiction books. But the way you've described, and having read the first of the YAs that I'll be reading, I suspect it'll probably be more consistent in the YA genre than it is in adult fiction.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. Like, I've just been trying to think of some YA thrillers that do sort of present policemen in sort of like a more likable role. Off the top of my head, the only one that I can sort of think of is Two Can Keep a Secret by Karen McManus. It's a long time since I read that book, but there is like a good police character in that, essentially. Like, he's a likable character, but he is the only cop in that book who's presented in that way, and it's because he's willing to listen to the teens and do what he can to help them in their investigation, although he's still like very much stuck in sort of like the perimeters of his job role, but he's not dismissive of them as the other police characters are. So I was just thinking about this a bit more, actually, and interestingly, I think he's the youngest on that town's police force, and obviously with it being a YA book, it does make his character more relatable for teen readers. I think he's in his early 20s or something. So yeah, if someone's writing a police character in YA who's going to be sort of a good character, so to speak, we do seem to have this trend that they will be younger, and they're sort of like more inexperienced from the older cops who are sort of like more set in their ways. And obviously this can become a bit of a stereotype. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, interesting. I'm going back quite a few years now, so I'll be showing my age, which is not a problem. When I joined the police in the 1980s, it was very much a case of there were one or two younger police officers joining at that time, and this is in London at the time, but there was quite a lot of older, more experienced officers, which were kind of in a friendly but true way in some cases referred to as dinosaurs. Okay. Quite simply because they were stuck in their ways. They always knew the right answers, and they were kind of, oh, I've never done it like that before. So, and they weren't keen on change. Change was a big no-no because they'd always done it the same way. But of course, you have to have change because that's what keeps things moving and things, up to date. So my experience of those sort of experienced officers as a very young constable, because when I started in the police, I say I was a teenager when I was going through my training and apprenticeship, but I was 18, just over 18 when I became a full police constable. So that's very young. Nowadays, you tend to find they join a little bit older, but certainly in those times, there were a lot of officers joining at 18, which is young, and you're still a teenager, of course. And so there was quite an obvious difference in our approach, having just come from our training, to the officers that had been there for a long time. Who were a little bit, exactly as you say, sometimes, and this is probably stereotyping them, but it was the case with some, pretty dismissive of the younger officers and dismissive of anything that wasn't what they were used to, whether it was right or wrong. So I noticed that from quite an early stage. Things are very different now in terms of a lot of those sort of people have now served their career years, and they've now left the organisation. So you do find, as a rule, that it's quite a younger, certainly in the UK, the police service is a younger organisation now, and that goes right up through the senior officers as well, than it has ever been before, which I think is not a bad thing. You do need experience, but what you don't need is people who are so experienced that they think they can't learn anything else because they've done it all and they've seen it all. And every walk of life and in every aspect of life, you're going to get people like that, unfortunately, who are very difficult to educate. So that was my experience as a police officer early on. But I think you're absolutely right. I would probably split it into two areas where the police could be relatable to young adults. One is exactly as you've said. So me, when I first joined at 18, for those few years in 18, 19, into my 20s, I'm still very much in touch with my young adulthood because I'm still there, really, although I'm now doing a very responsible job as a police officer. So I could relate, I would suggest, better at that point to younger people because I'd been there and done it not that long ago. And I understood a lot of the issues that the young people were being faced with at that time. So I think that's really important. And I think you're right. Maybe the younger, less experienced officers who've not been in the force that long could probably relate to some of the issues and some of the individuals and situations far better. The other people, I guess, who would also are people who might have children or family members who are teenagers that they've had the same sort of kind of challenges and relationships and that sort of thing with them. So I think they could probably relate as well. The older, more experienced officers have got the life experience, and again, maybe deal with things in a slightly different way. I mean, I used to, having said what I've said about the experienced officers, it was a minority that were like that. Yeah. But there were also quite a few who I would go to for advice and help when I first joined, who were brilliant at their job, and who, when in the UK, more than ever before, you had community beat, what they call beat officers or beat bobbies, they called them, who used to patrol a particular patch. They knew everybody on that patch, that area. They knew all the kids. They used to kick a ball about with the kids. They used to, have a laugh and a joke with the kids. But obviously, if something happened and the kids got into trouble, they were often the officers who used to go to the house and have a chat with the kid. And a chat from that officer, who was almost like a friend to them and a confidant, would be better than anything that probably the criminal justice system could offer at that time, to make sure that if they had done something wrong, hopefully they weren't going to do it again. So I think you've got the three parts. You have definitely got the younger officers who can relate because they're younger to younger people. You've got the people who've got maybe children, family members who are teenagers, and they know exactly how it can be to be a teenager and what it feels like. We've all been there. And you've got the more experienced officers who are streetwise and know the kids and have respect for the kids, and the kids on the flip of the coin respect them as well. And I think that's important. And if you haven't got that kind of relationship and you haven't got that trust and confidence, you're not gonna confide in people. And it's important that they do in certain cases, and that if they've got worries and frustrations and something bad has happened, that they have got the confidence to be able to speak to somebody in authority about it, in the knowledge that that might be confidential if necessary, but that hopefully something positive will come out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So what advice do you have for aspiring YA writers who are wondering how to depict the police in their book? Because obviously we've just spoken about sort of the different ways that you can represent the police, whether they're like helpful or unhelpful, whether they're dismissive, whether they're set in their ways. Is there a particular way that you would recommend that someone depicts the police in order to avoid stereotypes, whilst also appealing to the YA market and the sort of it's almost a trope in a way where the police aren't typically helpful in YA service?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what the police are going to do. Like you said earlier, Madeline, they're often in the background with YA, and they're doing, the bumbling kind of antagonistic, I guess, approach to whatever the situation is, which is not great from a reality point of view, but actually, sometimes is the case. Let's not get away from that. Hopefully it's a minority, but we have to be realistic. So I'd say it depends on whether you're going to write them as a quite a focal character within the book. If you are, make them real, because we are. I say we. I can't help using the word we sometimes, even though I don't do that job anymore. But it just comes kind of naturally. But they are human beings like everybody else. They've got a private life and a family, and they've got emotions and thoughts. And yes, they have a job to do, and it's not necessarily an easy job, and it doesn't always result in people having positive views of them for whatever reason. Perfectly understand that. But if you are going to put them as maybe not a lead character, or maybe somebody that's involved quite a lot in the book, put some reality into there. I do often think if I read a book and it's about a police officer, if there's just a little bit in there, not just about the procedure, because as I say, that can be really quite dry, but about that individual officer as a human being, their emotions. They may be going through some trauma of their own at home for whatever reason. So I would say maybe include a little bit of that as well. By all means, have them as the unhelpful, dismissive officer, but maybe think sometimes about putting a little balance in there about why they're like that. There could be many different reasons why they are the way they are. And on the flip side to that, if you've got somebody that is supportive and really, really helpful, make sure you cover those sort of issues, because again, they're important. If you have the trust and the confidence, that's really important, to be able to share some really important information with somebody in authority like a police officer. I think that's really important. So in terms of the procedure, you don't need to put lots in there, I would suggest, and the more there is, sometimes the duller it can be. And of course, you don't need to get it right either. You could have a rogue police officer that does something that they're not supposed to do. That's not illegal, but it's probably not what the police manual says that they should do. They don't write something down, or they say something to somebody. So include those sort of issues as well, because they're all kind of real life. But I would say just think about the characters, particularly if they're going to play quite a pivotal role in the book. If they are a detective or a uniformed officer, something to do with the criminal justice system, why not think about why they're like that, and maybe include some of those issues in the book as well, without diverting from the main the main storyline and the message that the writer's trying to get across.
Yeah, exactly. So it's all about sort of building the police character into an actual character, like a three-dimensional character, just as you would any other character, really, rather than just using them almost as a plot device to say that, we have got a police presence in this book. So
yeah, and I think it would also, if you did have quite a focal character who was a police officer, maybe not necessarily the lead, but somebody that plays quite an important part in the book, then include those issues. Just go behind the uniform or the dress of a detective and have a look at the home life and the circumstances, because actually there may be issues. They may have their own children, or they may have issues within themselves that they've struggled with as a teenager, or a home life that's something that's going on that actually kind of influences the way they are altogether, but particularly when they put that uniform on, or when they go out and face the public as a detective. There might just be some reason why they are like they are. And I think exploring those issues without necessarily detracting from the main focus of the book would add to the kind of the impact that the book has on the reader.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So do you think it is necessary to always have actual police characters in YA thrillers, or is it enough just to have like the teenage protagonist taking on the roles of the detective without any actual police presence, like even in the background at all? So I'm just thinking from my own point of view, like when I'm writing sort of a YA thriller, my sort of like gut instinct is to not have any police in it at all. And usually I don't have any police presence at all in my first draft, because at that point I'm solely sort of thinking about my main character's sort of characterization. I'm thinking about the conflicts and the sort of shape of the book that I want it to be. And well, for me, it does make it easier if I don't include any police, because then I haven't got to do all the research and I don't really risk getting any details wrong. But typically when I'm sort of like working on revisions, or once I sent it to my agent and I've got feedback from her, we do tend to sort of like add in sort of like a minor police presence just in the background. So just to like sort of like anchor it a bit more to the real world, to show that the crimes that are taking place, they're not happening in sort of this isolated bubble, and that the police realistically would be involved. So I do sort of like bring it in a little bit then, but I do realise I do try to keep my police presence down to like an absolute minimum in my YA thrillers. But yeah, I was wondering like what your thoughts are on whether it's possible to have an effective YA thriller without any police presence whatsoever.
I think it is, yeah, and I understand your viewpoint, and I guess it's shared by many YA writers, I guess, in terms of if you don't include it, you don't need to necessarily have to research, and you don't need to worry about getting the details absolutely spot on. And I think you can write a very, very good YA book without any police involvement. But as you say, if it's around criminal issues and the sort of things that police would get involved in, then I think there needs to be some reference, but it could be simply just that, a reference to the police. So in other words, you know, your character or their parents or somebody has made the police aware of this issue and they're not interested, they're not bothered, you know, they've not done very much at all. So you could make reference to, without having to think about the procedures necessarily, you could make reference to those kind of things within the book. So they're there and people are aware that actually, you know, they have tried to report this, or it has already been reported and investigated, but not to the level that's sufficient to get to the bottom of what's happened for whatever reason. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's like I say, if you're going to put the procedure in and it's going to be quite detailed, then it needs to be right, but you don't necessarily have to put it in. And I could see quite easily that you could write YA thrillers, those type of books, without having either a character as a police officer or really that much reference to the police as an organisation. But you might need to refer to them now and again throughout the book, just to make it clear to people that, you know, these people aren't just going off trying to solve their own crimes for the sake of it. You know, they've tried to do it the correct way in terms of reporting it, and for whatever reason have been frustrated and felt it necessary to kind of do their own inquiries and track down the people responsible themselves. So yes, you could write one without involving the police at all, which is probably music to your ears, because it then means that you don't have to worry about those sort of things. Or you could just reference them, or you could just have some very small involvement from maybe one particular detective or police officer, you know, who the young people have gone to for help, and then what the result of that is. So there's quite a bit of flexibility there, but certainly doesn't have to involve the police. The way they're written, sometimes it's best to have limited involvement with the police in them, unless you're going to go down the route that we mentioned earlier, where you're going to use one of your characters and go in, have a little look at their background as to, you know, why they're behaving the way they are, why they can't help. Or it might, as I said earlier, might just be simply a case of it doesn't fit the priorities in terms of they've got so much else to do and there's not enough of them. It might be something like that. Depends on the reason why they're not getting the justice, really, and if you delve into those issues. But I think I would say YA books, having just read that one and the way we've talked about the content of some of the others, are ideally placed to have limited police involvement, you know, unless you're going to involve them as a central character, or there's a particular crime within it, where maybe a kidnapping or a murder or something like that, where you really are going to need the details right. Because sometimes authors will contact me and they're asking me questions because they're not necessarily going to write what I tell them in the book, if that makes sense. So when I pick the book up later and read it, which I often try and do, it's nice when you see in the book some of the advice, not verbatim, of course, but some of the things that you've mentioned to the author by way of advice. But sometimes what they actually want is they want to understand what would happen really, and then they write the book accordingly, if that makes sense. So, you know, they won't write it exactly how I've told them it would happen. They might think, right, they just want the understanding of what the police response would be, for example, to a kidnapping or an abduction or another crime. What would the police do? Who would be involved? How long would it take? What wouldn't they do? Why would they do it? Once I give them all that information, they can take that information in and then decide how they're going to write the book. And sometimes I'll advise, for example, I was working with an author recently, and she wanted to include a particular role of a police officer, a specialist role. So we spent quite a lot of time engaging in relation to that specific role, telling her how the training went, what sort of things they did, you know, what sort of hours they would work, what sort of emotional impact it would have on the officer themselves. Spent quite a lot of time, but in the end, when the writer sat down with everything else, they couldn't quite get the character to fit the story the way they wanted to. So that was kind of put to one side. So sometimes it's just about having that understanding to be able to help you to formulate the novel and work out the plot and what sort of characters. And obviously it's more important if it's a lead character that's a police officer, because you've really got to get that right in terms of what they do, because people will read it and they will identify any shortcomings within it. So I think it's just important to have something in there that's right. But if you don't include it, it's absolutely fine. It won't make the book less enjoyable, as long as you realise that if it's going to have to be realistic, that it needs to have some kind of element of realism to it.
Yeah, I was just thinking another way that often YA thrillers sort of get away with less of a police presence than adult fiction is, like, often they take place over a shorter time span, and often you've got these teenage characters going away somewhere in a place where the police can't physically access them. Like, I know a big thing, I'm just thinking of, I think it's called Black Ice by Becca Fitzpatrick. She has her teenage characters going sort of away for a weekend, or it might be a week, in a cabin in a woods, and heavy snow cuts them off from the outside world. So when they're stuck in that cabin, physically no one can get to them. They haven't, like, all the phone lines go down, they haven't got internet, so they're completely cut off from the outside world. And then it turns out one of them commits a crime against some of the others. So then they're pretty much locked into this cabin where they haven't got access to the police. So in that book, you've only really got the police presence at the end, once these characters have solved, like, the mystery of who the bad guy is, and once they've sort of, like, saved themselves, and then the police are brought in at the end just to, like, show that, well, in real life, if this did happen, you would have a police presence, but only at the point where they could actually get to it. Yeah, I can think of a couple of adult novels that sort of, like, utilize that strategy as well in order to sort of reduce police presence, but in a realistic way.
Yeah, and I think certainly in an isolated location that would be absolutely spot on. There's some reference in the darkest corners to woods in the middle of nowhere and phone lines and things, phone signals, absolutely spot on, where, you know, they are on their own kind of thing and there's no choice. And the other option you've got with I guess the US and particularly the UK is movement. The police have boundaries, geographical areas of responsibility. And if you're going to go across those areas of responsibility, sometimes it's difficult for the police to communicate with each other. So if they're looking for somebody and they travel a long distance, you know, there's less likelihood of the police becoming either aware of or involved in a situation like that, just because of the way the whole boundaries and the organisations are set up. But yeah, I think you're right. Putting yourself in a situation like that where nobody can get there because of where it is, because of the isolated nature. Perhaps you go somewhere and you don't tell anybody other than a friend where you've gone. Those sort of things would be ideal for that sort of writing, certainly.
Okay. So yeah, what are your favourite thrillers and mysteries, like, overall, like, looking at the adult genre as well? Do you have any favourites?
Well, when I was kind of younger, there's two authors that I would call were always my favourites: James Herbert and Jeffrey Deaver. So you can see coming from there the sort of books that I used to read, like kind of a little bit of a horror in it, but with a bit of a thriller element and those sort of things. They were my favourite authors, and I still enjoy revisiting them and reading them now. And as I said earlier, I tend to read quite a lot of psychological thrillers now, particularly by authors that I work with, because I like to understand their style of writing. Sometimes it helps me when I'm advising them to understand how they approach writing a book and what sort of things they do and don't include in it. Certainly at the moment, two authors that spring to mind: C.L. Taylor, who I know has been involved in this con as well. I've been working with C.L. Taylor for a number of years as her advisor on the police side of things, which is really good. But I know she's also written YA as well. She's got the treatment before, and The Island will be coming out, I think, next year. So that's an author who I read all of her books and enjoy reading them. There's another author I've just got into recently called Fiona Cummins, who writes quite dark books, which are kind of a little bit floating around the sort of Herbert-ish kind of thing in terms of some of the things that are in them. And another author that I really like is someone called C.J. Tudor.
Oh yeah.
Who has written The Chalk Man and The Taking of Annie Thorne and a couple of others recently. And when I give a review on that book, I think I put something like this is pretty close to something that you'd expect from James Herbert, just by the way the book's written. They're just different. So I've got a bit of a kind of different approach to it, but I say a lot of the books I do read are from authors who I work with, because it helps me to have a to work with them more effectively. But I'll read anything, of course. I read a lot of true crime as well, an awful lot of true crime, and I read quite a lot of historical true crime. So a real broad cross section of different types of books. And I say YA is now on the list, and I'm getting a bigger and bigger list of what I need to be reading. So I'm going to be pretty busy in that area in the next few weeks and months, no doubt.
Yeah, there are some amazing YA thrillers out there. So yeah, I can always send you more recommendations if you ever want any more.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. The favourite one that you're, they think I should start with, and then I can probably go from there, I think.
Okay, great. I can see your books in the background behind you. So did you want to just sort of like talk briefly about those before we finish?
Yeah, they're over this way somewhere. There they are in the background. Yeah, there's two books. These are they would help writers in the UK who are writing anything about crime, whether it's true crime or crime fiction. I think they'd be of interest to any crime fan, whether you're in the UK, the US, or anywhere else in the world, because they've got case studies in them and things like that. This is the Crime Writer's Casebook. This is the first book that I wrote. What happened was I teamed up with a crime historian a few years ago, and we decided to write some books together. So these are jointly written. I provide the contemporary police information from, say, maybe 1980 onwards to right up to today. Stephen Wade, who's an author friend of mine, provides the historical. So he talks about crime from the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, etc. And there's lots of information in the Crime Writer's Casebook, everything from how the police in the UK investigate murder to forensic evidence, the role of experts in the police, a little bit about what happens when you're arrested in the UK and the process that you would go through at the police station. There's lots and lots of information in there that would help writers, but would also be of interest to anybody that likes to read about crime. Book 2 came out in March 2019. This is called Being a Detective. This is more specifically about the role of a UK detective. It's written in a different way. It's actually in an A to Z format. So, for example, we start with A. The first, there's entries in every letter of the alphabet. But in A, you've got the word alibi. So I talk in a bit of detail about what an alibi is and give some case studies when alibis have been used in crime cases. The ABC principle, which is something that detectives use to try and help them to solve crimes. And all the way through to Z. And in Z, we've got a zombie knife, which unfortunately is an offensive weapon that seems to be quite popular these days with certain individuals, and one that's used to commit crime. So there's lots and lots of different entries in here. But the joy about this book, from my point of view, is that Stephen talks again about historical detectives. So detectives in the UK were formed in 1842. And he talks about Sherlock Holmes and, that sort of thing. But I bring it right up to date to right this minute. So I'm talking about cybercrime, telephone scams, internet crime, all sorts of crimes that are committed that are more technical these days than maybe were in the years gone by. So that's book 2, and they're both out. And at the moment, I'm still writing. So I'm hopeful in the future we might be able to make another announcement for more books that are coming out. So those are the 2 books at the present time.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I'll keep an eye out for like a future announcement then. So yeah, is there anything else that you would like to talk about before we finish this video?
No, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I've enjoyed being part of YA ThrillerCon, and hopefully people who have been watching it live or watch it later on will enjoy it and find it useful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for joining. Yeah, if you're watching this and you want to know about the other panels, readings and interviews that we've got going on, then all the details are on the website www.yathrillicon.co.uk.